All right, great. So thank you everybody again for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. So now we'll be starting the Life in Canada transition talk. So like I mentioned earlier, my name is Tyler and I work with the International Programs Office here at New College. Before we get started, I just want to let you know a little bit about me. So I myself was an international student for most of my learning growing up. I was born in France and my first language was French. I moved to America when I was pretty young, and I used to move around every year. I finished high school in Florida, and then I decided in high school that I wanted to start something new, live in a completely new place. So I also came to U of T for my own undergraduate. Why I'm sharing my backstory, which isn't super relevant, is to say that migration and moving and supporting educational immigrants, which is what we're all here today. If we're here for this session, you're an educational immigrant or migrant. You came here to better yourself and seek new opportunities, and we're really excited about that. And that is something that I personally am really interested in because it speaks to my own experience, and it's just something that I find really fascinating. As international students, you have made a huge decision to potentially leave your country, file a whole lot of paperwork, do a lot of work, all that so you can study here and seek opportunities. I know the whole process wasn't easy, especially during the pandemic in the last year and a half. And so if you want to chat, if you want to share your story or talk about things going on, I hope that you know that I am one of the many people at the university that are dedicated to supporting you and succeeding in this really exciting chapter of your lives. Now, this presentation is based on some of my anecdotal experience, recommendations from students in the past, and some academic studies in the field. We'll talk about all of it in a bit of a mix, and I'll try to keep it from getting too boring. First and foremost, something I'd like to mention is that everybody's experience will be unique to them. So while I'm more than happy to always share about my experience at the University of Toronto, peer leaders will be happy to share about their experience, and many, many other people you'll be able to meet will be happy to share. It's really important to keep in mind that how you experience this transition, how you experience the various things that we're about to talk about later in this presentation will be unique to you, okay? So while we may be able to help and support, it'd also be great to know where you're coming from and the things that you yourself are experiencing so that we can better support you. So a few things that we'll be chatting about, like I mentioned, is we'll talk about cultural transition and what that means for students coming up. We'll talk about personal identity and how that interacts with your new environment, how that could affect your transition and different things that you might have to handle or mitigate. And then finally, we'll talk about some strategies that you could go into with your first year for success. The reason why I asked these questions is that I wanted to kind of put forth that you're not alone. The reality is that, as you can see from all of the poll questions, is that some students answered yes for a lot of these and that some students answered no. The reality is that the answers to these questions won't determine your first year experience, won't determine how your transition to university is going to be, but it very well may influence it. So things like, have you been to Canada before? It's really easy to understand and maybe imagine how having been to Canada or having lived in Canada could make this transition to University of Toronto, studying at U of T, a little bit easier and maybe even a little bit harder. Same thing goes for whether or not family members have attended university before you, whether or not you've attended an English-speaking institution, whether or not you already have friends or family in Canada, and whether or not you would feel comfortable starting a conversation with an English-speaking domestic student. All of these things in terms of academic literature are some of the things that students identify that they do or don't see as a potential obstacle or support system going into their first year studies. And so why I wanted to mention it is, even if you've answered no, 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 no for all of these things, you are absolutely not alone, and everybody in this room has varying levels of experience with transition, various levels of interaction with Canada in the past. And by being in this room, we are hopefully creating a community of support already. The goal of this entire program, at least one of them, is to connect our international students at New College with each other so that you can support each other. So hopefully you can keep that in mind, that we're all in this together in a way, and we're all here hopefully to succeed together throughout not only the whole week of orientation, but for the years of education you have ahead of you. So if you look through the chat, you'll see a bunch of different responses from everything from hockey team to warmth to difference from other places, which I think is something that would be really interesting to hear more about from students, but maybe we can chat about that later. But I think something that we're all identifying currently is that Canadian culture is a total mix. Like, you have everything from beautiful views to maple syrup. And something I want to identify and kind of state as fact is that Canadian culture is not what we would call a monolith. It's not a single identifiable thing. The reality is that Canadian culture is influenced by Canadians and non-Canadians and immigrants, including everybody in this room. By being in this room, by having this exact conversation right now, we are taking part and we are influencing Canadian culture to a point. Obviously, we're not shaping it entirely. We're not Drake. We don't decide what culture is, kind of like he does, seemingly. But we certainly play a part in it. So what I want to say is that while Canadian culture is complex and has many different layers and many different experiences and ways of interaction, we all are playing a part in it at the same time. So as international students coming to U of T, I think it's hopefully empowering to know that when you either arrive here or if you've already arrived here, you yourself are contributing to the Canadian culture, you are part of it, and you, I hope, don't see yourself as outside of it. I know as an international student, it's really easy to feel like the foreigner, like the outsider, like the one who's maybe not supposed to be there. And there are those perceptions and there are those attitudes, and I know it can be difficult to tell yourself otherwise, especially when perhaps students are talking about something that you've never even heard of before, and you're like, what in the world is that? And you have to find out what a toonie is or a loony and all of these various things. The reality is that you as an international student are contributing to Canadian culture as well. U of T has 20% international undergraduate students. If 20% of the members of any culture are something like international, it's hard to say that they are not part of the culture themselves. So I think it's interesting that, like Zhuwei mentioned, that it's totally different from China, but the reality is that there are so many Chinese immigrants in Canada. There's a lot of French immigrants like myself in Canada and British immigrants like she mentioned. And all of us bring our own cultures to the country and shape it in a way. And then on a similar note, are there any subgroups of Canadian culture that you can think of? So by subgroups, what I mean is smaller parts of the culture. Like international students, for example, are absolutely a subgroup of Canadian culture. And while people are typing in the chat, while people are thinking, why I bring this up is exactly that as international students, as migrants, as people seeking education in Canada, we form our own little subgroup in Canadian culture. And that is potentially a place where as international students, we can seek comfort and refuge. Exactly like Trish mentioned, we're an important part of the culture. Students and education and migration are a huge part of what shapes the Canadian identity. For many decades, governments and institutions in Canada have focused on migration, have focused on education as a means of expanding what is considered Canadian. You will often hear a phrase, multiculturalism in Canada. And while that's something that in academia and in social research is being discussed a lot with various points of view, something that does remain true is that as international students, as immigrants to the country, we're contributing to the multicultural ideals of Canada, and we are, in a very important way, expanding what being Canadian means. In a similar vein, U of T, much like how international students or students in general can be a subculture of general Canadian culture, U of T has its own culture as well. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or any ideas of what U of T culture might be like. Have you heard a reputation of the University of Toronto? Is there something you imagined potentially when you were applying to the university? So yeah, I think that we see that our friends in the chat are identifying a lot of interesting parts of U of T's subculture. It's partly focused for many students on studying, on academic achievement, but as well for others, it's about getting involved in extracurriculars and expanding our breadth of things that we feel comfortable doing and exploring. And something I'd like to note is that, similar to what the answers were in the chat, is that U of T culture is also not a monolith. It's really complex and it has many, many, many different subcultures. In fact, if you think about something like U of T organizations, U of T clubs, it's really easy to identify how these clubs and organizations are not only helping U of T grow culturally, but they're also providing really interesting and wonderful places for U of T students to create their own communities, create their own homes, and find a place that they feel they can express themselves, and while also shaping the larger culture as well. Coming to University of Toronto as an international student, it can be really daunting to get involved with extracurricular opportunities. And we'll be talking more about that later this week. But we do highly, highly recommend to try to meet students, try to get involved in organizations when you can, because that's those opportunities to get involved with those subgroups, to learn about those subcultures of U of T. I myself didn't know so many things coming into University of Toronto, obviously. And while a lot of my learning happened in the academic space, in classes and with professors and lecturers and through assignments, I would say that at least half, if not more, of my learning happened in engaging with fellow U of T students, learning about the organizations that they're working with, that they're creating, the initiatives that they're starting around campus. Especially now that we're returning to in-person learning, which is something I'm personally very excited about. I think it's going to be really exciting this year to see how U of T clubs and U of T organizations are expanding what they're doing to try to make U of T something better than it was before. And as international students, you bring a really interesting and necessary point of view to a lot of these organizations. Also, you're bringing knowledge from different countries, different educational systems, different approaches that these organizations could really benefit from. So it's not only you who will benefit, hopefully, by being involved with organizations and clubs and getting involved with students on campus, they will benefit as well, without a doubt. A lot of the things that you may be excited about or you may be worried about will be addressed either in this session, which we're already doing, or in the different events that we're hosting for the rest of the week. So like it was mentioned, I know some students have quite a few academic concerns about passing, about achieving certain grades, about knowing which courses to take. There's a lot of different academic concerns that are totally valid when you're starting your career at the University of Toronto. So that's one reason why we have an academic session with a U of T professor to talk about the difference of expectations and the transition that many students experience when it comes to switching from submitting high school work to submitting university level work. As well, we're going to have sessions with peer leaders and former or current international students, upper year students at the University of Toronto, to talk about how they adjusted not just the academic expectations, but different social expectations, different ways of getting involved in extracurriculars, finding jobs at the University of Toronto, or just in Canada in general. I know that when you're taking this big step into a new country and a new academic institution, there can be a lot of questions and a lot of worries. And one reason why I wanted to do this breakout room was so that you could see that it wasn't just you who potentially had some nerves or had a lot of things that they wanted answers to. I think it's fair to say that every international student has at least some questions and some more than others. And why we're having this whole program is to hopefully not just answer those questions when we can, but offer you ways so that you could answer them for yourselves as well. Great. So, like I mentioned when we began, cultural transition is something that's studied academically at the University of Toronto and around the world. It's not just international students who move to different environments and have to learn a new culture and adjust to new expectations. This happens all around the world, whether or not we're talking about refugees, whether or not we're talking about economic migrants who move to different countries to seek opportunities like new jobs, and like yourselves, educational migrants who come and hope to attain certain education and use that to either acquire employment or to work in academia. So what you'll see here on the slide is something in academics called the culture shock curve. What you'll see is that on the left is the respondents' personal rating of satisfaction, and on the bottom, you'll see months in a new country. One thing I want to say is that this exact curve is not the trajectory for everyone. Sometimes the point of culture shock happens much sooner or much later. Same thing goes for the honeymoon period and the adaptation. But the general principle, the general idea of the culture shock curve is that often when new migrants come to a situation and have to experience and adapt to a new culture, there's a honeymoon period, which is really exciting. You can think about this as maybe going on vacation to a place you've never been before. You know how that new place can be like super cool and new and everything is great and tastes delicious and looks awesome. That kind of vacation euphoria, that excitement that you get on vacation, that often happens when we move to a new place. Everything is new, everything is exciting, and that's why it's often called the honeymoon period. But that period doesn't last forever. With time, as time passes, many migrants and many newcomers to new spaces find that they start to miss home a little bit. They start to miss what they were used to. They start to yearn, they start to want what they had before, even if maybe what they had before wasn't something they liked. All because you're potentially a refugee from a country and you left of your own free will, doesn't mean there weren't parts of your home country or your past country or culture that you miss and that you quite liked. For example, I was a French immigrant, and I know one thing I really miss, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but bread matters a lot to me, like the food, bread. I love bread. And missing good bread is a thing that would happen and does happen. Obviously, that's not very serious. I chose a very silly version, but it can be something as important as family, missing the connections that you had, the close friends potentially that you had, and all of this lacking, all of these things that you maybe no longer have can slowly descend into something that's often called culture shock. It sounds super scary, it sounds super bad, but really what it means, it's that period where you potentially don't feel comfortable in the space that you currently are anymore, and there's potentially a desire to go back to the former space. So why we bring this up, or why I mention this, is that I want to emphasize that this experience, this maybe initial excitement and initial euphoria, and then potential decline in your excitement, the difficulties that come with transitioning to a new space, are completely natural, expected, and okay. As an international student, you may sometimes feel the pressure to be enjoying every single moment because it's seen as an incredible opportunity, and it can be, but that doesn't mean you have to be happy about all of it all of the time. It's entirely valid to have feelings of sadness, to have feelings of disappointment, to be frustrated. It's difficult to adjust to a new culture. It's difficult to adjust to all of these new expectations, whether they be social or academic. All of these are things that we're having to do that we're potentially not used to. And it's not easy things. And I do want to say that the support systems at the University of Toronto are built such that we recognize that cultural adjustment and how difficult that can be. And we highly, highly encourage students and recommend that students get in touch when that transition, when that culture shock or that adjustment is getting a little bit too difficult and you need some support. I truly believe that as the international students here with us today and those who couldn't make it are absolutely capable of adjusting to their culture in the way that they see fit and reaching that kind of point on the graph called adaptation, which is when the researchers say that we have essentially found a way to call this new place home. It's maybe not the same, but it's our new home. But that transition, that time can take support. It's hard to do on your own. Some people absolutely do it entirely on their own, but you don't have to. There are a lot of support systems at the University of Toronto. That's why we have programs like this specifically for international students, because we recognize that international students face really particular challenges. And we want to help international students succeed. And part of that success, whether or not it's academic, whether or not it's social, is seeking support from many students. Yeah. And so a question I want to ask you with, and you don't have to answer in the chat because obviously this is a personal question, but do you personally think you'll experience culture shock? I know quite a few students have told me in the past that they didn't think they would experience culture shock, maybe because they studied in high school in Canada for a few years, or maybe they have family in Canada, or maybe they've studied internationally before in another country. And so it's not their first time they're having to move for education. All of these are absolutely valid points. And it may mean that you don't have the same culture shock curve that you see on this slide. Maybe the dip at the bottom isn't so big, or maybe it doesn't happen at all. At the same time, some of those students who said that they wouldn't still did. And all because you maybe don't expect yourself to have the culture shock, all because you maybe have had experiences that you feel have prepared you for this, doesn't mean that if maybe it gets a little bit more difficult than you expected, that you can't seek help. Regardless of whether or not you expected it, regardless of all of the things that you've done to prepare yourself, I hope you know after today that the support is here and it's open to you regardless. All right, so we talked about the general trend of cultural transition, and now I want to chat a little bit more about what makes that trend happen. So the big thing that really tends to affect cultural transition in terms of the research that has been done is that a lot of things in your life are changing, whether it's where you're waking up in the morning, what you're eating throughout the day, who you're spending your time with, what you're spending your time doing. All of these things potentially have completely changed. You're waking up in a different bed, maybe. You're having a completely different breakfast than you had before, and then you go to a different school or a different class. Your life could potentially look almost unrecognizable based on what it was before. And so that's a lot to deal with as an international student or as a student in general. You'll find that this cultural transition that I'm talking about isn't limited to international students. It's especially prevalent, but domestic students absolutely have it as well. Whether or not you're moving from a small town in Ontario with 500 people potentially to a giant city like Toronto, I've met plenty of domestic students who've had quite the culture shock themselves. So a lot in your life can change. Something worth thinking about for yourself and maybe preparing for, if you're here already or if you're coming shortly or maybe later down the line, is what changes do you think will have the most impact on you? So, for example, Trish mentioned in the chat that comfort food that makes us feel better, can be really, really important for people. It absolutely is for me. And potentially something as simple as that is something we need to think about. And if we're thinking ahead, if we're planning about what will have the most impact on us, maybe we can try to set up some strategies for ourselves about what to do about that. So for example, do I talk to my family back home and ask them to maybe send me a routine care package with some like treats that I really like and I can only get from home? Or do I find a place in Toronto that sells those things? And maybe they're a bit more expensive than normal, but it's worth it because it helps me feel better, and that's pretty important. It looks different for different people depending on what that change is, but it could be very beneficial for you to spend some time thinking about that, and I hope you do. It could be anything from setting up Skype or Zoom calls with family. It could be if you have a hobby that you really like, making sure that you keep doing it. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but trying to anticipate and trying to look forward to the future and seeing what we think matters to us and what changes could be harder to deal with. What resources and strengths will you use to respond to that change? All of you have been accepted to the University of Toronto. You're clearly bright students. You're clearly engaged academically, but also in your extracurriculars. You wouldn't be in this room otherwise. That's just the truth. Higher education is a thing you have to seek and work hard to achieve, whether or not it's U of T or one of the other amazing universities in this world. But the reality is you've obviously shown a lot of strength and resourcefulness already. And so what strengths and resources that you already have and have already practiced can you potentially use, right? So for me, I know that I moved around a lot every year, like I talked about earlier. And when I was looking back on my own experience, something I thought about was I was pretty used to meeting new people because, like I mentioned, I moved every year. So I'd have to meet new people constantly. So that was a strength and resource that I leaned on during my university experience to try to excel and to honestly adjust to all of these new expectations. I leaned on people and I asked for support from people who I thought would be able to help me, be able to guide me, that would know more than me in many, many different ways. And whether or not that's maybe one strength that you think you have or not, try to identify for yourself what you think your strong points could be and how you could use them to transition to the University of Toronto in a way that you would think would be beneficial. Great. So how do you think you'll respond, right? Like, again, all of this is about looking to the future, looking to that period of culture shock and adjustment that I talked about a little bit earlier, and trying to anticipate things that you could do to make it a little bit easier for yourself, to prepare for it so it's not as much of a surprise for you, right? So when we're asking, how do you think you will respond? We're really asking, do you think these strengths and resources will be able to address the different changes that you see coming? And if not, and if so, what can you do about it, right? If, for example, let's say, use me as an example again. If I'm really, really worried about academics and passing at the University of Toronto so I can continue studying here, and my strength is connecting to other people, that's maybe not the most helpful strength, because I can connect with other people great, but they certainly can't write my assignments for me, as much as I'd like them to, maybe. That would not be okay, obviously. So how can I use the strengths I do, or maybe I don't have now, to address those changes? For me, what that looked like was I would connect with others to find out how they were addressing their academic concerns, but also talking to support systems that exist. When you don't have an answer to something, when you don't know what to do, sometimes it's good to approach the people who are there to support professionally, whether that's myself, whether that's Trish, whether that's your instructor, and talk to them about what you're experiencing, and talk to them about, this is what's happening, and I'm not quite sure where to go. Not everybody at the University of Toronto will have the answers, but hopefully they'll be able to at least point you in the right direction and towards the support systems or the resources that would be of benefit to you. All right. So we talked about the curve. We talked about expecting what's going to come. Now, what exactly is changing, right? I just want to quickly give an overview of all of the different things that could potentially change. There's some others too, but some big ones that are identified in the academic literature for migrants to keep in mind. So first and foremost, honestly, this is one that I really, really stress to students, and that's really important, at least in my opinion, is routine. I think it's safe to assume that when all of us were in high school, we had a certain routine. That routine is different for everyone, of course, but you personally, as an individual, had your own routine. You woke up around a certain time, probably. You had certain foods, you did certain activities, you studied for certain amounts of time, you went to certain places for class, you went to bed at certain times. All of these are what we call routines. So what we normally do throughout a normal day, right? When you're moving to Toronto, when you're moving to a different educational institution like U of T, and all of these things are changing, it's really easy for your routines to completely change. So you're waking up at a new time, you're going to bed at new times, you're going to different places. Those routines will change, and it can be really difficult to adjust to. So one thing we do recommend is trying to find, when possible, a new routine that you can be comfortable with. Maybe it won't look exactly like your old routine, but something that you can decide upon and take ownership of and control yourself whenever possible could be of benefit. Reactions, what we mean by that when we say cultural change is what happens when you do something else. So for example, something that I wasn't used to in Canada, or at least in Toronto, is that if you have lived in a small town before, it can be pretty normal to say hi to everyone around you. If you're from a big city, maybe that's not the norm. But I've heard from many students, whether they be international or domestic, that something like not saying hi to people on the street is quite weird for them, or the opposite. Or saying hi to people on the street in certain environments can be quite weird for them. So the different social expectations and the different reactions of those around you and the expectations about you can be different when it comes to cultural change. Our relationships. Obviously, we're going to have different relationships with our professors. We have new professors now. We have different relationships with support staff. Maybe we're used to our family members being around or helping us with certain things. A lot of that could change, and that influences the culture change that we're talking about. Our different roles have obviously changed. While you were a student before, you're a different kind of student now. A university student comes with different expectations. It comes with different levels of responsibility. Maybe professors won't make things as clear as they did before. Maybe certain expectations in terms of providing for yourself or taking care of yourself are different. Maybe you're used to someone else doing your laundry and now that's your responsibility. That would be a new role that's important for you. So thinking about kind of those day-to-day things and the different roles and different responsibilities that you're going to have might be helpful to maybe write it down or think it through, or whatever your personal process you think should be, about how you could adjust to those differences in expectations and your roles. And then finally, reflections, right? So you're going to have a lot of time to think about all of these things that are changing. And you can have time and you can make the effort to reflect on it and see what you can do to approach it, what strategies you can make to adjust to these different expectations and this change of culture. So I talked a little bit about me. So I'm going to use myself as an example because I don't want to speak for everyone else. I just chose 3 things that I thought kind of showed my routine and how I personally have adjusted to culture. So I've graduated from the University of Toronto now. I'm no longer a student, but now I'm a staff member at the university. And that for me was a different culture change because being a working adult is obviously different from being a student. So maybe this isn't super related to being a student, but I just want to show that I myself have had my own change, and this is what it looked like for me. For me, exercise is important for my mental health more than anything. I don't really care about how fast I am or how good I am at a certain thing, but when I'm exercising, I usually almost always feel better mentally later. If I'm having a bad day, if there's a lot of stressful stuff going on, if I'm worried about a student, obviously these can be difficult things to deal with. And so exercise, and for me, that's cycling mostly, really helps with that. Next, you'll see my 2 dogs. Those on the right is Peanut, on the left is Butter. They are lovely. They're currently sleeping behind me. I love them very much. I spend a lot of time with them, and they are just as much members of my family to me as anyone else. And they help take care of me in many, many ways. Just like I exercise maybe when I'm feeling stressed, for me, walking the dogs, for me, hanging out with them, even just talking to them. I know they don't understand me. I still talk to them like they're humans. But just talking to the dogs helps me work through my own thoughts and feelings. And then finally, bread. If I'll say it once, I'll say it a million times. I love bread. I like making it. I like eating it especially. I actually made that loaf there, which I'm quite proud of. It's probably the best one I've ever made, but that was a long time ago. That was like early pandemic, back when everybody was baking. But yeah, so food is pretty important to me. I find a lot of comfort in food. And that's something that maybe has influenced my routine and my own health and well-being. So why I mentioned this, like I said, is it may look entirely different for you. Maybe if you had to put 3 pictures of your routine and different supports that you could use, they would be completely different. But the point is, it might be helpful and it might be a good idea for you to try to think of what some of those things could be for you in this year coming up. It'll be difficult to do it in the moment when things are really stressful and really hard, because when we're stressed and when we're sad and when we're having a hard time, it's not always easy to think about anything else other than how stressed we are, other than how sad we are, other than how hard this is. So trying to think ahead while you're feeling okay, maybe, to things that you could do, resources that you could use would be of benefit. Great, so I'm actually going to take a quick break, one moment. I just have to move because my computer is dying. All right, apologies. Okay, I am back. Okay. So just like I mentioned, those were my personal approaches to adjusting to a new life. When I was studying, it didn't look exactly like that. I didn't have dogs yet. And instead of cycling, I ran more, and bread was still very much a part of my life. But throughout different stages of your life, you'll have different opportunities and different elements of your identity. So, like I mentioned, try to think about the different elements that make you who you are, right? When you think about what are the things you like, what are the things that make up your everyday, what do you think makes you you, and how can you maintain those things while adjusting to an entirely new set of expectations regarding university and social life and so on. That can be current hobbies and interests. Those are the things I picked for my free things. It can also be things that you want to do in the future. Obviously, university is a transformative experience. We're all here to do new things, to learn new things. Maybe your three things don't need to be things that you already do. Maybe they're new things that you've been wanting to do for quite some time, but you just haven't been able, but now you are able because you have the access and so on. So what I'd like you to do is, like I mentioned, try to think about your identity and your interests and see how you can either expand them or retain them during all of these different changes in your coming days. So building your community. So this is something I kind of just quickly chatted about. So for all of the things that we just mentioned in the chat, and thank you so much for submitting so many awesome options, are things that either can be potentially connected to your benefits that you have access to through your student fees, or services that you also have access to through your student fees. And then all of these would be potentially recorded on something called your co-curricular network. So different benefits could be like having a support network, exploring career options, being successful as a student. Different services that we have on campus will be everything from all of the hundreds of unions and clubs that we have on campus, different study groups that you can set up with your classmates, the Center for International Experience, obviously New College Student Life, which is who we are right now. And then finally, they meet in something, like I mentioned, the co-curricular learning network. That is an online kind of resume tracking in a way. So what you do is you register your activities and your involvement at the University of Toronto, and it's formally recognized by the university when a staff member identifies that, yes, for example, Tyler volunteered at this event. So not only would this be a good opportunity for maybe future jobs or future study opportunities that you might be interested in, but it has a lot of benefits like the ones that we just identified. And hopefully it can, all of these different opportunities that you will get involved with in the next few years can be related to your own routines and interests and your hobbies. If so, I imagine how that would be really beneficial in a lot of ways. All right, so we're getting close to the end now. So we're just going to talk about some additional supports for international students. I hope that I've stressed seeking support enough today. If there's anything I want you to remember after this session, is that we recognize that being an international student can be particularly challenging in many ways, and that there are many supports specifically geared and aimed for international students that we hope that you'll reach out to if you wish and if you'd like to. So international transition advisors work at the Center for International Experience. They can help you navigate campus. They can help you build communities around campus, making action plans, which is kind of like the plans I'm asking you to do now, but more specific and intentional. So international transition advisors are a wonderful resource. You can make appointments with them on the CLNX. If you'd like to, the link to doing so is right there. And then some additional supports for international students here at home at New College. So Trish, who is here with us today, who's our Assistant Dean of Students. Jared, he will be joining us for other sessions of this New Journeys program. Those also accessibility advisors, learning strategists, and librarians. And then for international foundation program students, you'll have myself, James, who's here today, Kendra, who's our coordinator, who I'm sure that you received many emails from, and then Lily, our assistant director, who you may have also received emails from as well. So for direct entry students, the left side of the screen is more applicable, and for international foundation program students, the right side of the screen is specifically for that program. Last, but certainly not least, is MySP. So this is actually a service that the University of Toronto has paid for on behalf of its students. What it is, it's live mental health support via text or call. It can be video or just chat on your phone, okay? So it offers help in, as you can see, 140 different languages. I'm willing to bet that pretty much every language spoken in this room is covered by MySP, and they have counselors who are hired to speak to students and support them in their own language if they prefer. Having to translate your thoughts into English, if English is not your first language, while seeking support is an added step and an added difficulty that I definitely don't want you to have to take if you don't need to. If you would feel more comfortable speaking in a language other than English, especially, MySP can be really, really helpful. And I highly encourage everyone here today and everybody watching this recording asynchronously to download MySP and set up your account today. Just like we talked about with routines and with setting your goals for the year, it may be really hard to start new processes and to do certain tasks when things are difficult. When we're really sad, when we're really stressed, downloading an app and setting up an account is probably the last thing we want to do. So if we do this ahead of time and do a little bit of preparation, hopefully this is here for you when you need it. As well, you don't need to be in crisis to use this app. If you just want to chat with someone because you're just wanting to chat, then that's also entirely fair. These counselors understand that not every interaction needs to be a crisis. So whether you have it on your phone or your computer or just the web browser, it would be great to set this up ahead of time. All right. Great. So if anybody has any questions, we will be ending our session shortly. Please feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. We will also be posting a discussion board on Quarkus where you could ask questions for upper year students in the later sessions this week. So 2 sessions on Friday will be with upper year students. Some of them, most of them will be international, some of them will be domestic, to talk about their experience and to also help answer, I'm sure, a whole bunch of questions that you'd like to ask specifically students. I know that I was a student at U of T and so on and so forth, but it's been a while. So maybe you want to ask someone who just did it now or who's actively doing it now. So one question we just got is, where can we access the recording of this meeting? So we will be posting these recordings on the New College Orsol YouTube account. So it is recording. We are going to be posting them, and then we'll be sharing the links via email, okay? So you can expect that soon. Great question. Great. So do we have any final questions today? You're welcome. More than happy to help. All right. So while we're maybe waiting for some questions, I'll share this. So here are some personal contact email addresses. So I mentioned that we're obviously here to support you. For the Office of Residence and Student Life, we have new.orso@utoronto.ca for general inquiries. If you would specifically like to reach out to Trish or to Jared at Orso, their email addresses are on the screen. And then as well, if you have questions about the International Foundation Program or your academics or anything to do with that program that you're in, feel free to send the general email. And also, here is my personal email as well. I love getting emails from students. I'm more than happy to chat. So if you would like to email me directly, please feel free to do so.